Okay, so I'm going to go over the first full chapter in Master and Emissary called Asymmetry in the Brain. The chapter before this was just the introduction. The introduction does do a good job of kind of spelling out or summarizing, maybe a better word, the kind of the big picture themes and ideas in the Master and his Emissary. And in this chapter, some of those ideas start to become fleshed out in a little more detail. Specific articles are cited in support of some ideas. And then the chapter after this is even more of that. So these first few main chapters in the book are helping to kind of characterize the left and right hemispheres, or the functional differences, and kind of connect some of those functional differences to some of the big picture ideas in the book. So for this recording I'm making right now, I'll talk about some of the highlights of this first full chapter, Symmetry in the Brain, and I'll also provide a couple ideas for option 1 and option 2 of your Master and his Emissary paper. So the first things I had these slides are posted, by the way, on Blackboard in the Master and his Emissary slides folder. Here is the same thing. So these first few slides are the exact same things I showed you in the previous one. Here's paper option number 1. I'll remind you, you choose a topic both Gazzaniga and McGilchrist cover in the books. And it needs to be something, it needs to be a topic that involves some type of cognitive or functional component. You need to be talking a little bit about cognition or the functions of different regions of the brain. And then in the final paper that you'll write, you'll talk about the topic from, as it's described in the textbook. That's kind of the first major chunk of the paper. And then the next major chunk would be the topic from the Gilchrist perspective. And those are just kind of summaries. But then the part at the end is describing McGilchrist's speculations regarding the topic that you chose. And I've mentioned previously that a lot of times those speculations are kind of the big picture themes in the book. He takes kind of these claims about hemispheric differences, and then he kind of makes some speculations. He connects them to kind of these bigger picture ideas that he believes. And so that's what you would describe here in this kind of the third major chunk. First kind of major chunk, this is what Gazzaniga says about the topic. Second is McGilchrist, what he says about the topic. Then third, you're kind of starting to connect what McGilchrist said about that topic to some of these bigger picture themes, some of these speculations. And then finally, at the end, kind of your opinion. What do you think of McGilchrist's perspective and how he connects it to these speculations? So that's paper option 1. Paper option 2, once again, choose a topic about cognitive neuroscience. There'll be some specific claim that McGilchrist makes somewhere in Master and his Emissary, which is in which he uses at least 2 citations to support that claim. So you have to specify that claim, or it might be kind of like 2 sentences if they're related, like maybe 2 claims that are kind of related. The left hemisphere does this, the right hemisphere, technically that's 2 different claims. The left hemisphere does this, the right hemisphere does this, but they're related, obviously. And I would want to quote. And then you'll find 2 articles for the final paper, and you'll describe them in detail. And then towards the end of the paper, you will evaluate whether the claim that McGilchrist makes using those 2 articles is justified, whether you think that the claims he made about those articles are true. And you can kind of connect some of these claims. I mean, he's going to make a claim, and that claim might involve some of the bigger, it might be a claim which is kind of connected to some of the bigger picture ideas in Master's Emissary. And that's certainly something that you can talk about here. If he'll make a specific claim, like this study says the left hemisphere does this, this study says the right hemisphere does this. And you can spend a little bit of time in this paper kind of connecting it to bigger picture ideas, though the main goal of this paper option 2 is, as it says here at the top, is kind of practicing skeptical reading, critical analysis of articles and of claims that people are making about articles. So those are kind of a review once again of these 2 paper options. Last time I did talk about some of these bigger picture themes that were talked about in the introduction. Another bigger picture theme is this idea that the left hemisphere is dependent on the right hemisphere, but it's also parasitic on the right hemisphere. And related, the left hemisphere has become increasingly unopposed by the right hemisphere. This claim that the left hemisphere is becoming more powerful than the right hemisphere of the brain. That's a particularly big picture claim. And here's some of like the kind of the sub claims regarding that. And some of these will be evidence will be supported in support of this kind of bigger picture claim right here. Okay, so I'm not going to go over those things from the intro again. But here is a topic. So here is some things about from this current chapter, Asymmetry in the Brain, that could potentially be option number 1 topics. So choosing a topic that Gazzaniga and McGilchrist both write about in their books. Talk about what Gazzaniga says about that topic, then McGilchrist. Then you'll kind of connect, then you'll talk about how what speculations McGilchrist makes about that topic. And then you'll talk about whether you find his speculations to be convincing. So one option, something that he does talk about in Asymmetry in the Brain, the function of the corpus callosum. So the kind of a key thing about this is, in order, if you want to do the function of the corpus callosum, that's definitely something that Gazzaniga talks about. In fact, I'm pretty sure the chapter we're doing right now in lecture, there's some of that. And McGilchrist definitely does it too. And they agree on some things, but there's clearly some places that they disagree. So you could definitely do the function of the corpus callosum. And if you want to do a good job, you would need to connect it to some of the bigger picture ideas in the Master and his Emissary. And I'm not going to exactly say what those bigger picture ideas are, but I will say this. I have a clue right here if you choose to do this topic. McGilchrist's proposed function of the corpus callosum is relevant to his claim about the left hemisphere's betrayal of the right hemisphere. So he talked about some of the different potential functions of the corpus callosum. And then throughout the book, kind of this idea that he introduced in this chapter about the function of the corpus callosum can be relevant to kind of, it is relevant to, and at least he claims it's relevant to understanding the kind of the story about this betrayal of the left hemisphere to the right. And so obviously, if you're going to choose this topic, one of the things you want to understand is, how could the corpus callosum, how is it relevant to this betrayal that he's talking about in the book? How could the function of the corpus callosum be relevant to this? And you need to pay special attention to those ideas in the book. Another potential topic is the function of the frontal lobes. So this one might be a little tough because we don't have like a section in this class where we're just like, okay, this unit, we're just going to be covering, here are all the different functions of the frontal lobe. We do talk about the frontal lobe, but usually it's kind of in different chapters. Like we'll talk about a little bit in attention. We talk about it a little bit in language. There's probably, there's a little bit about the frontal lobe in the emotion chapter. So we talk about the frontal lobe in different chapters, but there's not actually a single chapter where we're just like, this is all about the frontal lobe. So in order to write this one, you might have to kind of read several chapters or several different parts of the textbook. Not all of them are we actually even going to get to in this class. Like we'll talk about, as I said, we will talk about some about the frontal lobe in lectures, but we're not going to talk about it. I won't talk about it tons. So you'd have to be a little independent about finding the parts of the textbook to talk about the frontal lobe. I will give you some clues though. Gazzaniga talks about the frontal lobe in chapters about cognitive control, theory of mind. And actually the chapter of theory of mind, I believe, is part of the social cognition chapter. So these are kind of, I think these might be in the same chapter. But cognitive control, theory of mind / social cognition, there should be some stuff about the frontal lobe there. And attention, there should be some stuff about the frontal lobe there. So if you're interested in the frontal lobe, the way you'd have to there's a lot in the textbook, but it's not centralized. You would kind of have to search around to find it. There is, by the way, there was some specific quotes in this chapter, Asymmetry in the Brain, where he's talking about the frontal lobe. And you might want to find those if you're interested in kind of this. There's literally like one paragraph. It's like, oh yeah, this is like this is like a theme that's going to be throughout the book. Some of these things related to cognitive control, theory of mind, social cognition, attention, and how the frontal lobe is important for those, and kind of simultaneously how hemispheric differences are important. But this is he talks mostly about hemispheric differences in the book in terms of the brain, but there is this thing about the frontal lobe and how they're involved with these different cognitive functions right there. So I got more examples of potential options. Option number one, topics. So this a pretty popular topic actually is just doing a study about attention and the neural substrates of attention, or it could sometimes it's like hemispheric differences in attention, or just the regions of the brain that support attention, because there's an entire chapter 7 of the textbook which is about attention. And there's definitely some overlap in some of the terms related to attention that McGilchrist and Gazzaniga talk about. If I haven't mentioned this, it's very clear to me that McGilchrist read this textbook. It's obviously an older edition of the textbook, but there's so many references to ideas that were presented initially in the Gazzaniga textbook that it's very clear to me that Gilchrist has read the Gazzaniga textbook, and he's probably read it pretty closely, including this chapter on attention. There's definitely some ideas presented in the Gazzaniga textbook, which McGilchrist cites and talks about. I do want to mention, though, and this is kind of a thing, that's, you'll eventually catch on. McGilchrist is much more interested in hemispheric differences for just about, that's like the parts of the brain he's most interested, the difference between the left and the right hemisphere. Gazzaniga, even though Gazzaniga is very interested in hemispheric differences as far as his research concerned, when in the textbook, Gazzaniga is kind of forced to have a more balanced approach where he talks about many different regions instead of just the hemispheric differences. So McGilchrist is more interested in differences between the left and the right hemispheres in terms of the different attentional styles. And that's not something that, as far as attention, Gazzaniga doesn't really talk specifically about differences between the left and the right hemisphere that much in terms of attention. He might do it a little bit, but it's definitely not like a focus in the textbook like it is in The Master and His Emissary. So this is another topic, although it's popular, it's kind of a challenge that actually a lot of the topics kind of have, is that some of the ideas which would be most relevant in the textbook, so ideas that are relevant in the text, like, McGilchrist talks about certain ideas about attention, and then they have to be similar to ideas that are talked about in the textbook. Your impulse might be like, oh, well, I'm talking about attention, I should read the attention chapter in the textbook really closely. And that's not a bad idea, but there are ideas that are relevant to hemispheric differences in attention that appear in other chapters of the textbook as well. So I don't necessarily, if you set up an office hours appointment or something, I might give you some clues as to kind of where to find some of this stuff. I want you to think about it. And the idea here is that attention is kind of this cognitive process that pervades many different aspects of the mind. Attention is important to language. Attention is important to emotion. Attention is important to perception, social cognition. Attention is kind of this thing which is all over the place. We do have a unit, which is just about a chapter, just about attention. But if you're starting to understand kind of the big picture ideas about attention, you'll start to see where in each individual chapter, there are kind of references to ideas which are relevant to attention. And that definitely occurs. I have one specific idea in mind, a chapter other than chapter 7, where Gazzaniga talks about hemispheric differences that are definitely relevant to what McGilchrist talks about in terms of hemispheric differences in attentional style. And by the way, I'll mention this also, I am definitely happy to talk with people in office hours. That's usually a usual thing. I'll usually talk to a big handful of students about their papers. And I'm definitely happy to do that, especially early on in the semester when we don't have to be stressed about it. Another topic, emotion and hemispheric differences. For all of these topics that I'm giving you suggestions for, there was at least like a sentence or a paragraph in this chapter, Symmetry in the Brain, which maybe these are all based on things that I read earlier today on asymmetry and from the symmetry in the brain, including something about emotion and hemispheric differences. He definitely makes claims, although if I remember this one, he does. It's not a long paragraph. This is like 1 or 2 sentences, and it's something that he'll come back to later on. Like all of these things, attention, emotion, and hemispheric differences. He's talking about them now, but like in future chapters, he goes more in depth into the research, and then even further into the book, he starts connecting these ideas based on research to more of these bigger picture speculations. He's already talked about in the introduction. He's already given us clues about where he's going to go with kind of these bigger picture ideas, these bigger picture speculations. Um, and so we kind of know the general direction he's going, or at least if you go back to the introduction, you could get refreshed about what the general direction is. And early in the book, he's now starting to kind of set the stage. He's starting to go into kind of some of the details about the research, and he gets more and more detailed in these early chapters. And then eventually we'll get more into connecting these detailed ideas about attention, emotion. What were the ones on this previous page? Yeah, the is the function of the corpus callosum and how it's relevant to the portrayal of the right hemisphere by the left, um, the role of the frontal lobes and hemispheric differences, but particularly the role of the frontal lobes for these different things, cognitive control, theory of mind. He's talking about them. He talked about them big picture only in introduction. He's starting to get in more detail about them in this first chapter, and he's going to go into even more detail in the up close chapters. And then later on, he's going to start kind of speculating, taking guesses about how these are relevant to kind of these bigger picture ideas. Yes. So yeah. Oh, and the emotion. One more thing about this. This is another chapter. There is a chapter which is specifically about emotion. I don't actually recall off the top of my head if that chapter talks anything specific about hemispheric differences. But once again, this is the type of topic where emotion is something that kind of pervades all of the different fields of psychology and of cognitive psychology and neuroscience. Emotions kind of everywhere. And so we do have a specific chapter where we focus in on emotion. But if you look really closely, you realize that a bunch of different findings in neuroscience that might be in different chapters are relevant to the concept of emotion. And so there's going to be places, probably other places outside of the chapter on emotion in the Gazzaniga textbook, which are relevant to some of the ideas that McGilchrist talks about regarding hemispheric differences in emotion. Oh yeah, so I like this stuff. I like the way, like one of the things I like about the Master and Emissary book is, he goes through these chapters where he'll start going into some of the details about research, but then usually at the end of the chapter, there'll be kind of a summary, which kind of reminds the reader of like, these are the big picture ideas. This is what I told you in this chapter. Here's why this stuff matters. Here's where we're going. Eventually we're going to get here. And there was some stuff at the end of this Asymmetry in the Brain chapter that I thought was important, and highlighting it for you. I mean, I've already read the book a bunch of times, so I know where it's going. I know the stuff in these chapters, or at least I have my opinion. I think it's an informed opinion about the stuff in these chapters, which is important, that I can highlight now for you so that you kind of know what to look out for in future chapters. So there is this idea. One of the kind of the foundational ideas is that there are hemispheric differences in the attentional styles of the left and right hemisphere. And he's starting to explain why he thinks that's important. It's starting to get to kind of a big picture idea of why the different attentional styles are important. And he said, this is a quote right here. And this quote, he's kind of said this a couple different times already in the book. Attention is a way of interacting with the world. He says it's attention is about like, it's different. It's like, he says it's how-ness. That's how he can, not what. He always talks about attention is more like how, which I think I kind of understand what he's saying when he says it's more about how than what, but probably more relevant is that this idea that attention influences our understanding of things in the world. Like you can look at the same object with kind of with different attentional perspectives. And the way you understand the object can change depending on the type of attention that you apply to that object. You can look at the same thing two different ways of using your attention. And each way of using your attention, the object you understand it in a different way. But I put in parentheses here because he also kind of says attention influences the things in the world. So he says that attention influences our understanding of things in the world, but he kind of hints that he literally kind of believes that like the way that we can apply attention literally changes kind of the reality of the world. Obviously, it changes our understanding of it, but he kind of hints that he actually thinks the way that we attend to the world can actually have an influence on the world himself. That's definitely getting closer to kind of these bigger picture ideas, that the way we can attend to the world influences the world itself. And here's a quote that I liked. So I'll just read it. A mountain that is a landmark to a mountain that is a landmark to a navigator, a source of wealth to the prospector, a many textured form to a painter, or to another, the dwelling place of the god is, I think it's dwelling place of a god, is changed by the attention given to it. There is no real mountain which can be distinguished from these, no way of thinking which reveals the true mountain. So it's obviously, you know, it's a single mountain, but these different people, the navigator, the prospector, the painter, and I guess this would be like, you know, Greek people who believe that the gods lived in the mountains. They have different ways of kind of understanding a mountain. It's the same mountain, presumably, but kind of who you are influences the type of attention that you pay to the mountain, the way you understand the mountain. And that changes like your reality, your understanding of the mountain. And he also says this other thing, which is important in kind of connecting some of these ideas about attention to some bigger picture things. He says, he reminds us that he's a physician, he's a neurologist, so he works with a lot of people with brain damage. And he says, for a person with a neurological or psychiatric condition, their condition isn't just data loss, meaning like it's not just that they're missing information about the world. He says that their condition fundamentally changes their world, their reality. And this will become much more clear, especially with respect to schizophrenia. He basically says people with schizophrenia, they kind of get stuck attending to the world one way, whereas people with, you know, intact hemispheres, we can kind of go back and forth to attending between these two different ways, like pretty easily. But people with schizophrenia, he'll say, they kind of get stuck attending to the world in a specific way. So that would be like a neurological or psychiatric condition, and that it can kind of fundamentally change what they perceive to be their world. It can change their reality. And so things which outside of the individual with this neurological condition, we see things differently. They're seeing it like a completely different way because they can only attend to the world one way. They don't have the flexibility of attention that others might have. So the inability to use attention he says it pretty literally, it can change their world. It can change their reality. And here's another quote that I really like. I do want to talk about this. I'm hesitant to just read the whole thing, but it really connects like a whole bunch of different really big picture things in psychology. I'll have to read some of it. If all things in reality flow and one can never step into the same river twice. So this should kind of echo something that you might have heard about in introductory psychology. And I want to go to the notes for this real quick. This stuff about William James. He talked about the stream of consciousness. And so I put some things in the notes down here, because like this quote right here is from Heraclitus. I believe I'm pronouncing that correct. Heraclitus. So that's one person talked about this idea that we can never step into the same river twice. And it's a metaphor which is used to describe consciousness, the mind. The idea is that we never experience the same thing twice, because each time we experience something, we come to that thing with a different set of knowledge than we had the first time we saw it. So you see something the very first time, and that's the first time. then the second time you see it, you now come to that object with a new set of knowledge, which changes your experience of that thing. And then the third time that you see it, you have even more knowledge. You never interact with an object with the same experience, with the same knowledge set. So the world is, they say consciousness is a flow, because you never experience anything the exact same way twice. Everything in reality is always unique. William James said that, and this Heraclitus person said that as well. And then, I'm not going to read the rest of it. I'll let you read the rest of it. But there is this idea that because of this, they're basically saying, James and Heraclitus, this is the nature of reality. In reality, everything out in the world is kind of constantly in motion, like a stream. And that for us to, be able to understand anything in the world, we need to have kind of these two different attentional sets, specifically like left hemisphere and the right hemisphere style of attention. You need both of those. And one of the attentional dispositions, we experience the live, complex, embodied world of individual, always unique beings, forever in flux, like the stream, a net of interdependencies, forming and reforming wholes, a world which we are deeply connected, a world with which we are deeply connected. That's one attentional disposition. And the other, we experience our experience in a special way, a represented version of it, which is static, fragmented, which forms with fragmented entities. Things are grouped into classes. It's a kind of attention that isolates, fixes, and makes things explicit using the spotlight of attention. And this is really getting to some big picture things. That second form of attention renders things inert, mechanical, lifeless. And so the first form of attention, he kind of describes as like the live. And then the second type of attention, he calls it lifeless and mechanical. And that basically the idea is to understand the world, you kind of need to have both types of ways of understanding it. One about understanding the flowing nature of reality. The other is the ability to kind of artificially isolate things, forming concepts, forming categories. So it's kind of a tough thing to understand, but we'll read enough about it. Anyway, it's philosophical, it's kind of a deep idea, but we'll have enough specific examples later on that I think it will become clearer what this means, and specifically how he ties it to the different hemispheres. In case you're curious, it's the right hemisphere, which he says is live and like the stream, where it's formed like in the right hemisphere, the attentional styles, things are a world of individuals that are always unique. Whereas the left hemisphere forms categories. People aren't individuals, they're members of a category. That's a big picture, definitely an important thing, important idea. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about is some more ideas for potential topic 2, option number 2. So remember this topic is you choose a claim and you just find citations, you read those citations, and then you write about towards the end of the paper, do these citations support the claims that McGilchrist made with them? So one claim that McGilchrist makes in Asymmetry in the Brain is the primary effect of callosal transmission is to produce functional inhibition. So that might sound like a bunch of words that doesn't really make sense decontextualized, but that's definitely a quote towards the beginning of this chapter. And he has 3 citations which he provides some support, 5, 6, and 7. If you did this topic, you would basically say the claim that I'm going to read papers about is the idea is that the primary effect of callosal transmission is to produce functional inhibition. You would want to actually quote that. You might want to provide a little bit of context to explain, like, McGilchrist was talking about this, and then he's made this specific claim. Give it a little bit of context so it's kind of, so just kind of situated. So it's like the paper is understood, like, why is he talking about this? And then this is the specific claim that I want to evaluate. And then the body of the paper would be, you would have to choose at least two of these. They need to be empirical papers, meaning they have actual experiments that were run and data collected. You read them closely, and then you evaluate. Do these two papers, do they actually suggest that the primary effect of colossal transmission is functional inhibition? And you're going to want to describe these papers, and explain how these papers do or do not actually show that the primary effect of colossal transmission is to produce functional inhibition. Another example, here's another quote, it's a longer one, but there's tons of articles in support of this. In general terms, then, the left hemisphere yields narrow, focused attention, mainly for the purpose of getting and feeding. The right hemisphere yields a broad, vigilant attention, the purpose of which appears to be awareness of signals from the surroundings, especially of other creatures who are potential predators or potential mates. So he's talking about the different attentional styles in detail. This is some of the specific research about the different attentional styles of the left and right hemispheres. And then here are a bunch of claims that he makes. There's more than just this. Citations 35 through 39, and then 52 through 53. And then I realized there were so many in this section of the chapter that I stopped listing them right here. But there's a whole lot. You only have to choose two. And then you would just do those two citations. Do they actually support this idea? How do they do it? What are the research methods that allow you to make claims about hemispheric differences in attentional style like this? And do you agree with them? Do the claims, are their findings convincing, and do they support this claim? And I wrote this here. There's this this is such a common, what he provides a lot of evidence about these kind of different attentional dispositions of the left and right hemisphere. This is not the only chapter where evidence like this is provided. So this is he's starting to explain it in this chapter, but he's not done. There'll be more evidence in probably the next chapter. I don't actually remember. It's one of the next one or two chapters, more evidence along these lines, a different set of evidence. So this is definitely something that he really wants to provide a lot of convincing scientific evidence to characterize the differences in the attentional styles of the left and right hemispheres. All right, last thing here is I do want to provide you an extra credit opportunity, especially if you sat through all 35 minutes of this. I do think this will be helpful this is the whole point of all these lectures that I'm doing on this, is to provide you kind of help you come up with ideas for your paper and to give you a better idea of what I want, of the types of things you can write about and the approaches for your paper. And this in particular, I think, can help you start actually getting some concrete ideas out. Obviously, you haven't read all of the Master and his Emissary yet, and we've covered not even half the chapters in the book, maybe a third of the chapters now we've covered in the textbook that we're going to eventually get to. So there's still work to be done, but it's not too early for you to start forming some ideas about what your paper topic could be. And to kind of motivate you in that regard, I will offer you up to 2 points of extra credit. And it's not tons of work, I don't think. And it's definitely could be helpful. And I will provide some feedback on it as well. So you can kind of get some ideas and some feedback, knowing whether your idea is good or not, or I don't want to say whether it's good or not. I can give you feedback about how to make your paper as good as it can possibly be, given your ideas that you provide me. For option one, remember, this is the option where you want to choose a topic which both Gazzaniga and McGilchrist talk about, and you'll describe it from each author's perspective in the final paper, and then you'll talk about how that topic is kind of connected to some of the bigger picture ideas in Master and his Emissary, and then whether you agree with the way those ideas are connected to the bigger picture speculations. I don't want you to do all that for this brainstorming exercise. Instead, what I want you to do is choose a topic that you think could work for option number one. It's a topic that you think the textbook will probably cover in some form. You can some things are obvious. We know the textbook is going to talk about attention. We don't know what we're going to learn in the textbook about attention, but that's definitely something we know we'll learn about. Emotions a chapter, language is a chapter. The textbook talks about cognitive control, social cognition. These are all topics which are in the textbook. choose a topic that you think could work for option number one, a topic which will be covered by both books. You know a lot now about what the Master and Emissary is going to cover topic wise. You know a decent amount what the textbook. You could start kind of thinking about topics that both authors will talk about. And then I want to quote from the Master and his Emissary from this chapter, Asymmetry in the Brain, just to demonstrate that the topic actually was written about in this chapter. So whatever topic you choose, it has to be something that was that's mentioned in the Asymmetry in the Brain chapter. And I need a quote that demonstrates that the claim about that topic was actually made, or that the topic was actually mentioned. And then I want a paragraph that you turn in on a Microsoft Word document about describing how you are kind of speculating about how that specific topic, so it might be hemispheric differences in attention, hemispheric differences in emotion. There's many different topics we could do. How is that topic, how do you think it will be relevant to kind of some of the bigger picture themes in the Master and his Emissary? Now, obviously you don't have the full big picture yet, but I'll remind you, in the introduction, he did talk some about these big picture ideas. He hasn't fleshed them all yet, but he did kind of give you hints in that introduction, and he gave you some hints at the end of Asymmetry in the Brain. And so I want you to start thinking about, you don't know the full story, you haven't seen the whole picture yet, but you've now seen some of the specific details of the evidence, and you know a little bit about the big picture. I want you to start trying to kind of connect the puzzle. Start speculating, take a topic and then try and connect it to kind of some of the bigger picture ideas. And then of course I can give you some feedback when I eventually read this, and after you turn it in, give you feedback, which can help. I can just say, oh yeah, you're on the right path, keep going with this idea. Or I could give you constructive criticism. Or if you're way off, I could say, maybe you should choose another topic. I can give you feedback, but I will give you up to 2 points, and I will give you up to 2 points based on the quality of what you turn in. For if you decide to do option number 2, definitely a very different type of assignment. What you'd have to do here is just pick a specific claim in the chapter Asymmetry in the Brain. And once again, it's a claim that could actually work for option 2. So it needs to be about cognitive neuroscience. And it needs to be a claim. I guess the main thing it has to be a claim about cognitive neuroscience in which at least 2 citations are provided. If it's a claim where only 1 citation is provided or something like that, I would maybe make an exception, but you would have to talk to me, and then we'd have to work out a plan together. And usually I'm just going to say, whatever claim, there has to be 2 citations there. Otherwise, you would have to make an appointment with me to do it. You have to quote the specific claims. I want an exact quote. He claims this. Here's the quote. Once again, you might want to set the stage a little bit. He made this claim, and this is kind of why he was talking about the specific thing. And then you will make just a reference section. So you're going to choose 2 citations. You don't even have to read the articles for this topic. You're just going to find a quote that you are interested in kind of critically analyzing. Is the articles that he's providing in support of this claim? Is the evidence that he's providing, is it support the claim that he's making? And then you would have to find some articles in the textbook, or in the Gazzaniga book. He just provides numbers, like little subscripts. And then in order to find the citation, what you have to do is look in the reference section at the end of the book. And there's 500 references. Unfortunately, to save space, they're incomplete references. They don't even say the name of the journal if you look at the end of the book. So then eventually what you have to do, that can give you clues as to who the authors are of the different citations, but you'll eventually need the full bibliography, which is linked. There's a link on it on the very first page of the syllabus. And what you'll do is you'll provide 2 full references for citations of those citations that were used to support the claim that you quote. You will put at least 2 full citations in APA format. So here you're kind of trying to connect, for option 1, you're trying to connect some topic to some of the bigger picture ideas in Master and his Emissary. In topic 2, you're picking a specific claim, and you're just having to find 2 citations and write out their the full reference in APA format. Okay, so that's a lot of stuff. I think that's it. Yeah, that's end of stuff. So I will stop recording here. I do want to remind you, though, I'm happy to talk to you guys about this stuff in office hours.